All right. Hey everybody, let's kick this off. I really appreciate you all coming today. And one thing about tonight that's totally different than what we've done before. If you've come to these meetups for Vancouver legal hackers, it's been a lot of talking heads that have been on the legal side of the legal tech, and it's been lawyers talking about, what's the future of the practice of law and all this kind of stuff, which is great. I'm a lawyer myself, so I'm not going to put that down. It's an important point of view. But at the same time, like getting the tech part of it, which is critical to our group, has been missing. And so I definitely want to get the input from developers, because without developers, there's no legal tech. And so tonight, we're talking about building legal tech, what's possible. And so as a lawyer, I have no idea what is or is not possible, but the great panelists we have tonight are going to help us with that. And so we have 3 experienced developers and influencers in this area here tonight, and I'd like to introduce them, and once I introduce you, come on up. We got 3 seats for you. So, I hope I get it right. Drew Ogryzek.
Wow, that was perfect!
Yes.
Yeah!
All right. And he is, he has the Vancouver Tech Podcast, as well as the Developers Slack Workplace and the other meetup group.
Hacker Nest?
Right, Hacker Nest.
Yeah, so actually this year I've been kind of dialing back a little bit of the community stuff and really just focused on the tech. There's a lot going on, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So totally happy to have Drew here. Paul Holden from Clio. Now Paul's interesting because he's also both a developer and a lawyer.
Nice.
So licensed in New York, so we'll have that point of view as well. And Khoa, Nguyen, who's with McKesson and I believe was with One MedNet. Yeah. All right, guys. So I guess first off, just an easy one. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, Drew, and what do you do?
Sure. Well, I work as a software developer. I'm sure everybody in this room has probably heard about blockchain and cryptocurrencies over the past year or so. It's kind of, I guess, over the past year, it's really taken off, and a lot of people are really hyped on the crypto side aspect of it. So I'm currently working with a company, Yandex, on a product called Ether Party that's about to launch. They did a successful ICO, fundraising, last year, and this will be the delivery on that promise. And it's actually all about sort of the cryptocurrency side of blockchain, which isn't something I'm very interested in. I'm super interested in blockchain, not so much the cryptocurrency side. And so now we're finally going to be able to move into working on some of the more interesting parts of blockchain, in my opinion, at least.
Yeah, and I definitely would like to get into that a little bit later. Blockchain is some really interesting stuff. And then Paul, just give us a little background on you.
Sure. Well, as you said, I'm a New York attorney and I'm a software developer. Primarily, I'm a software developer, actually. I was a developer before I went to law school, and then I went to law school, and then I came back to being a software developer. What's that?
Nick Zavo.
I work for Clio, which some of you might know is a company that builds a practice management tool in the cloud for lawyers. And I think that's basically the rundown. We can talk more about other stuff later.
All right, great. And I also want to mention that Clio sponsored our food and beverage tonight. So, yay, Clio. And also definitely, either during this or after, please help yourself to the pizza and drink. That's what they're there for. And Khoa.
So actually, before that, I'm going to say we are a Clio customer. But I guess because of the food, so I won't say anything bad now. My name is
what you want.
My name is Khoa, and I have trained in DBA and also did programming in BCIT. I work mostly in tech support I started working with the lawyer firm 11 years ago, and I found out there's a lot of things that I could do. So, and what is missing, what is currently not available in technology. So that's something that I want to discuss today with everyone.
All right, so I'm just going to go through some questions, but definitely, guys, bring up stuff that you think I'm missing out on, like if you want to talk about it. The first one, though, that I thought of was, what do you wish that non-developers knew about what you do that they don't? Like, it always comes up, and you just wish that they understood what you do better, and that would make the relationship easier. True?
I guess there's a couple of things, but one is that I guess two things. It's not about having an idea so much as it is about an execution plan, strategy to tackle it. A lot of people think, oh, just do this or just do that, and it's almost never just when you start to define a process. I would say basically, in a nutshell, developing software is on the one hand, it's coming up with a recipe. Anything you could do that's repeatable by following a recipe, you could program. And so a lot of the things that you might think like, oh, this is, if I'm doing the same thing 10 times in a day, that's probably something that you could automate that would be potentially worthwhile automating.
Okay. My thoughts are more around working with people when you're trying to develop software. So like the feature requests and stuff that come in. So I think the one thing that stands out in my mind is that people who don't write software believe that it's like infinitely malleable. You know, you can change it anytime you want to do anything you want, and that's true, but it's also not true. I think that if you're, how many of you are lawyers around here or have some legal knowledge? Yeah, okay, good crowd. So, you know, the law is infinitely malleable too, right? If you want to, like, you know, apply your thinking to it, but it isn't really that simple. It doesn't just do whatever you want it to do. So I think that that's kind of an important thing to understand about software is you can do anything you want with it, but it's not just instantaneous. And as time goes on, the further you get into a project, the higher the cost becomes of changing it. So that would be my thing.
I want to elaborate on what you said. I think with today's technology and the power of computers, we can pretty much do anything we want with computing, but it is a lot of work. And when the lawyers in our firm come to me and they said, just do it, and they don't realize how long it's gonna take to do something pretty simple to them. But it takes a long time for us to do so. When you say something, just do it, it takes a long time.
And sometimes the reverse is true.
True, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess coming from the lawyer standpoint, you hear it all the time too. Like, I think it's just, you know, dealing with people when they know what they want. Like, they know what they want, but not necessarily how to get there. You know? And it's just real simple, right?
Yeah, it's funny because sometimes something might sound like it's very complicated, but it's actually quite a simple process to program. Whereas the reverse, it sounds like it's really easy, but it's actually quite complicated. And that could even be, you know, I work mostly in like back-end development, but on the front end, that could even be something like, oh, move this button over here. It sounds like it's really simple, but what are the effects of doing so? How does that change potentially the way that users interact now with your site, where that button has to be on other places, the representation, the differences between workspace and whatever, and maybe even the mindset that users are going to have with regards to how they interact with that.
All right, let's go into some fun stuff. Like, what are some technologies that are developing right now that, I guess there's the shiny object syndrome that always happens, but what do you think really holds some promise in making waves? Drew?
In a sort of hand-wavy, sort of high-level point of view, I think definitely across some of the current hot topics and buzzwords like AI or machine learning, big data, and of course blockchain, I think all of those have a lot of very interesting potential. Some people talk about ethical concerns and things like that when it comes to AI. I don't really think that, I don't particularly find that to be a big daunting area, like the ethical concerns, but of course there will be some. But yeah, I definitely think that automation and even the ability to automate basic human needs, I think in the provision of such, is something that's potentially within the foreseeable future. Of course, there's a lot of things that would depend on.
Yeah. Paul, what do you think of promising technology?
I am not entirely sure what's promising. I can tell you what I think is fascinating and what I think might have some application. And those are two areas. One is natural language processing. I think that's a big deal if you can do something with case law and in the analysis, or Steven's back here. He did a little project at a hackathon where we met a while ago, trying to figure out where there was ambiguity in the terms of contracts. So these kind of natural language processing things, I think they're fascinating, and I also think they have potential. The other one that doesn't get a lot of airtime, but I also think it's fascinating and may have potential, is content addressing, rather than IP addressing or whatever. So there's a pretty interesting project called the Interplanetary File System, and as far as encrypting your data and distributed storage of the data and reliability of access to that data, I think there's a lot of interesting potential going on there.
For me, I think about this. Just from my law firm, it's nothing fancy, nothing like machine learning or anything. There's a lot of things that, one thing that if you understand lawyers, they are very conservative and they're very behind in technology. One lawyer in our firm, he doesn't have a computer. And so for me, just to get the lawyer, get some automation, allow the lawyer, the technology allow the lawyer to work from home, but have some structure with the requirement about where the data have to be stored. For example, Canadian data have to stay in Canada. Find a way for a lawyer to remotely work. Some of those things, for me, it's interesting and it's closer to home than AI. I watched one of the meetup. I was at Microsoft, and there was some software. I can't remember her name. She was from the U.S. and she said something very interesting, and it really triggered me. She said that she pulled her software out of the company because the user didn't use. And I think about my lawyer who didn't want to use a computer. So maybe there is something about the software, how it operates, and maybe if we can make that change and improve it, maybe the older lawyers will accept the software better. So from the UI, UX, or user experience, maybe that will help. So that's how I think about the
maybe taking some
technology.
lawyers on field trips too to check out, so, like, here's some developers, like actually see what they're doing, and see it in a real context instead of just what they think it is about.
Could I add one thing to that? Because I think you both brought up some pretty interesting things, and with where we're at currently, the ability, things like content addressable web, for example, or IPFS, that also adds, and it is an implementation of sort of peer-to-peer. Now we have like peer-to-peer networking. This idea that you have self-sovereign sort of governance over your own data, for example, and what you choose to share with other people. Imagine a world where suddenly every sort of interaction or transaction, you get to define the terms under contract for who you would enter into, or who you would enter into a transaction with, what sort of transaction it would be, and what those terms are, or you just don't enter into it. Then an interesting thing would be, now, do we look at these sorts of contracts and say, are these legal within this area of access to this peer-to-peer network? Does this group of peers now say, oh, we're prepared to interact with anybody provided they satisfy this interface of particular contractual agreements, as an example, and that's really what blockchain is.
And just for people that have come in, there's some seats right here in the middle if you want to sit down, and there's also some seats that are kind of hidden here on the side if you want to come up. Anyways, so the smart contracts, that's kind of interesting because the next question I had was, okay, there's these technologies. Which of them do you think would have application in the law? Like what kind of legal use, or what would be the kind of technology that would have the best legal use, you think?
I'd say some low-hanging fruit, one particularly right now that I think would be interesting to work on, and I'm sure there's some companies that already have done something with this, is like the notary public model, where you have somebody who is licensed to witness things or to authorize certain things, and all you really need to do is to be able to prove that this person signed off on that being true. That would be a perfect implementation for something where you have so public-private key. Basically, the way that works is I can give everybody a public key, and you can use that to know whether or not I've signed it with my private key. Basically, whether I've authorized the use of this with my private key. So now you can access it with my public key. And so being able to do that in an automated fashion, that also is stored as an accurate transaction virtually forever. And you could do that potentially on something like IPFS. Therefore, also again, potentially, I mean, we'd have to take a look at the laws, but are we going to be able to obsolete the law that Canadian data has to stay in Canada, or that there is even Canada or Canadian data?
And IPFS is the content addressable.
So sorry. And all of that, like the content addressable thing, it sounds kind of fancy or kind of funny, but if you think about basically all content that can be accessed through a computer lives on files, and if you run a file through an algorithm, so basically an algorithm that you put something in and you get something out. Now you can imagine any sort of device where, let's say I put something in, and if I put that same thing in, I'll always get the same output, but I might not know what that's going to be. But you can imagine in a simple way, let's say I only put in words, and my algorithm outputs that same word with the last letter at the front. Then I know that if I put in the same word, I'll always get the same output. If I put in a different word, I'll get a different output. In a way, a little more complicated way than that, but that's what a hashing algorithm is. And a hashing algorithm is used so that I can take a file, run it through that hashing algorithm, and that same file will always get that same output. That's why when we saw things like BitTorrent sites where they have the seed of the file, they don't actually host the file, they host the hash of what that file is. That way, let's say you have that file on your system, but you also have a million viruses. And I know that your computer is called virus host, and I want to get that file from you, but not any of those viruses. I don't have to trust you or your computer. I can trust that that file has that content.
Based on that signature at the end of it.
Exactly.
Paul, what do you think about what technology, like what would make the best use in legal?
It's kind of hard for me to answer that question because I have like the practical answer and I have the more fascinating answer. As I said earlier, I'm pretty fascinated by natural language processing.
And by the way, we'd love to hear both.
You love to hear both. You love to hear the hypotheticals as well. So I think that for lawyers, probably a big impact is these kinds of tools that you can use to eliminate ambiguity in a contract or figure out which parts of your contract might be subject to challenge based on the case law that's available to you, right? The things that take the heavy labor out of, again, it's the contracting, but drafting a contract, you're drafting legal arguments to present before a court. Some of these tools do exist. I was looking at a company that I was looking at a few years ago, and they've actually released one of these products. It's called Judicata. It takes an analysis of your arguments, your factum, and tells you where your weaknesses are, or tells you where you can attack your opponent's factum if you throw your opponent's factum at it. So I think those have a pretty large potential. It's hard for me to say exactly where they're at now because I don't really know the state of natural language processing, but I do know there are a few tools out there and people are working on it. The other aspect of the more practical is that I think things like Zapier, tools that just deal with your daily, more mundane tasks, right? That you have to do all the time and waste a lot of your time, or that you just don't want to do more than once. So, Zapier is the first one that comes to mind. IFT is another one like that. These kinds of things just let you automate a few things or automate notifications. I think that those could probably have a pretty big impact on a lawyer's life, but anybody's life as well, right? I mean, I, for example, was looking, I don't shop very often, but I was shopping for something on the Best Buy website, right? And I just wanted to wait till it came below a certain price because I wasn't interested in buying it above that price. So I didn't want to check the thing every day, right? And this was a great tool for me just to get a notification, tell me when this thing comes below my threshold price, because otherwise I'm not interested. Same thing with there's a really great film festival here in town. It's called DOXA, the Documentary Film Festival. Some of you probably know it. But I want to know when they upload to their website their new program for the current run of the festival, right? And I don't want to. I know it happens in May, but I don't want to go kind of checking their website every few days in May to see when the festival's starting. So those kinds of things, in your environment as a practicing lawyer, I think that those right now can have a big impact, separate from the NLP stuff, which may come down the road or may already be there.
Yeah, I think sometimes we maybe focus like on the shiny like new stuff, but there are a lot of practical wins that are low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
How about you, Khoa?
Yeah, that's exactly where I think we should focus on, because I think we can really improve on what we do. The day-to-day, for example, when a customer comes back, they still have to fill out all the information like manually, and then the lawyer have to wait for them to finish to do that. So some of the automation will really help. Also, another thing is data sharing. In medical imaging, you can share patient data like file by file. With lawyer, most of the time we give is like a file, like a physical file, or maybe we have to scan in. But if we can find a way to share it out the way that medical already have access, that would be a fantastic way, so that a customer, a client can go from one firm to another and have that data share quickly. Nothing that you have to manually burn CD or anything. So those are for me it save a lot of time, lawyer time and assistant time.
I think something else to bring up is a lot of time with contracts and with law. A lot of the times, it's not so much the contract or the situation; it's the intent, and the onus to prove the intent. And so I think a lot of maybe those more complex issues will still need to be arbitrated or need to be resolved somehow. I think a good example is BC's online dispute resolution portal, for example, where you can go through so much of the process that's automated, and that might actually account for maybe 90%, I don't know, 60%, 10% even, but a huge percent, I think, actually, of most cases could go through that. But then it's the the edge cases that don't. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't still make use of this automation. It frees you up for the more interesting work.
So let's say hypothetically that there's a lawyer sitting in the crowd or somebody who works for a law firm, and they hear one of the things you're talking about, get totally excited about it, and they want to make it happen. What is the best way for them to approach you and do that, other than I have this great idea and just make it happen?
Briefcase full of cash. Just kidding. It's a really interesting thing. I've heard of a startup in San Francisco where they actually took developers and lawyers and said, okay, let's make this happen, and applied. If you're working day to day as a lawyer and you're sitting with a developer or maybe a product developer and kind of seeing like, okay, what are your pain points? What's actually happening? Where are we repeating this process? What's going on? Can we start to automate this? Can we start to put this together into a software as a service potentially and sell it to other law firms? That's now a business proposition. That could be something. I think most of the time, I think a lot of software developers are very interested in talking about different ideas, but also probably at meetups get approached a lot by people that say, oh, I've got this great idea. do you want to come and work for me for free for 6 months, and then I'll give you a cut of the profits that I make.
So that's not a viable plan, right?
That particularly may or may not be, but I think a lot of people probably have that, so their initial reaction might be to be turned off by it. But if you continue to talk with them and ask some ideas, I think generally, I was going to say I think generally software developers are very outgoing, happy, and would love to talk to you, but that's not always the case.
All right. Paul, what do you think?
I think kind of a practical example of what you're talking about is hackathons. If you have an idea, I would say first you probably need to take an online tutorial in how to write some code. You don't need to become an expert, kind of get yourself familiar with it, and then go to a legal hackathon and pitch an idea and get together with some developers and build a prototype. I think that's something that you can just start getting involved in, and I think you have to think of it as something that you're not going to just build a product out of that, right? I mean, what you're talking about is really an incubator where they're putting people together and building up something, the foundation and the infrastructure to get a product together, which if it's available, sounds great. If it's not available, think of something like a hackathon and set your expectations accordingly, and build a prototype, learn something about the problem you're trying to solve, learn something about the code, and maybe find some people with a common interest who if they work with you in the hackathon, they might want to work with you more later and see where that goes. That doesn't guarantee any outcome, obviously, but I think it's a practical suggestion for where to start.
Another thing might be to consider building a software product is fairly long term. It's a fairly long term thing. It's not a week process. It's potentially years, but definitely months at the very least. And so consider, are you going to be able to bring somebody into your workplace and that will work with you? Is that okay in your work environment? To see what your pain points are, to develop some sort of software. Is there a market for that? Are you going to want to go out and do user testing with people on the street? Interestingly, Shannon Salter, I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she spoke at this meetup before about basically, I guess, product managing the BC resolution, the dispute resolution portal. And that was the first time, I kind of had an idea that, lawyers, they're pretty smart people. My father was a lawyer, but I kind of thought, they know words, they don't know tech. And so I was incredibly surprised at, I think, at how well, at least that meetup was presented, but at how well someone who came from a legal background, who was a lawyer, took to product ownership and was able to really lead the development of a successful product. So give all yourselves credit as lawyers that you could probably do that, maybe, if she can, but she's pretty amazing.
I think I second what you said, but I think one thing that I would tell the lawyer is that I find them very impatient and they don't have a lot of time. If you have an idea, if you want to develop something, think through that and then explain it to me in a way that I understand. They are an expert in that field and they wanted to do something. They talk the lawyer way. For a tech person, it's very hard to understand. So unless you have time and sit down and have a long-term relationship, it's really hard to develop the software the way in your mind, because I don't understand what's in your mind.
I think another practical suggestion that I find useful is I love podcasts, and I listen to a variety of podcasts, legal and technology podcasts, both separate and combined, the whole works. But you can, if you like reading rather than podcasts, you can read articles. The thing you probably want to avoid is spending too much time reading articles or listening to podcasts that are talking about the new shiny thing and not talking about something practical. But there's certain podcasts, if you listen to them over time, you'll gather an idea of what's out there, what's happening, who's working on interesting problems, and so what's available, where the weaknesses are, and what's going on. And I think that'll help inform as well your own kind of ideas.
Particular examples?
I would say there's I think I forget, it's the Lawyer List or the Legal Talk Network. The names get mixed up with the brands. Lawyerist. Yeah, so they have a bunch of different podcasts put together. Some of them are more or less useful than others. That's one place to look. There's a podcast called Building New Law, which I think is based out of Toronto. That's a pretty decent one. When I listen to these things, I don't listen to every episode, right? I pick the episode that's actually interesting, and so there's a bunch that I might never listen to. For stuff more technical, I really like the Software Engineering Radio, which is put out by the IEEE, and a podcast out of Texas, I think, called Changelog. So yeah, those are some that I listen to.
I think it's good to also consider what do you want to get out of it? Why are you trying? What do you want to accomplish? Software development is really software is kind of the tool that delivers a product that delivers business value. So it's building a business essentially, or developing a product for a business. Not necessarily for a business, but I think most software is kind of that. So are you trying to build a business out of this, or is it something you just want to automate your day-to-day tasks?
So I got a selfish question for you guys, because with Vancouver legal hackers, like I said, the idea is to get this cross communication between developers and lawyers, and I've heard more than 2 or 3 times from you guys that there's this communication gap, basically, between lawyers on the one hand having a certain expectation of things, and developers also having an expectation of how it would be to work with lawyers. So what do you think would be some good ideas of ways to get those 2 different types of people in a room to actually have a meaningful conversation? Would it be workshops, do you think, or
In my opinion, it's something we don't have here tonight, and that's alcohol. No, but seriously, I think that sort of the social type events. I think Jim over there and I met at a social event as well, and he's a lawyer with a software product, and that's interesting. I think that was a really great thing for him to sort of go into the community, see what's going on, have a drink where you can kind of talk casually and get to know each other with no sort of pressure on either side. And then you can schedule meetings later and go and do that. I think that's a good way to put it.
That's Hacker's Nest, right?
That was Hacker Nest, yes.
Similar group to this, except it's all developers. And a nice group of people here. Go to Hacker's Nest, it's all developers here. Great group of people, so approachable, so friendly. So have some great stuff on the ground.
Hacker Nest.
Hacker Nest.
No, yes.
Well,
It's Hacker Nest.
and I set up some socials. It was like coffee, then beer, then coffee, like rotating. So maybe I'll just make them all beer socials.
Well, it's. I think a lot of people, lawyers. So there's some lawyers that probably like presenting in court, and most lawyers probably don't. And I think there's some software developers that like talking to other people, and most software developers probably don't. But once you have a little bit of alcohol, and it's not everybody drinks, but having a drink. At Hacker Nest, by the way, there's usually about 150 people, and the amount of alcohol that's consumed is usually less than half a drink per person.
Really? Yeah, I've been to one. I've been to one.
Unlike some other places. Maybe.
That's an interesting thought.
For like half an hour or 15 minutes?
That's 2.5 hours.
How many people participate in that?
In the actual
sample?
drinking?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I would say that there's a handful that have far more than the half half a drink, and most of the people I probably don't even drink.
We were working on a cake on the night.
Oh, nice.
Well, what do you think, Paul? Like, what are some ways to get people together?
I don't think I have a good answer to this question. One thing that does come to mind, it may not be directly related, but there's different ways of thinking about software and law, right? And we've kind of covered them here, but we haven't really spoken explicitly about what they are. But one is like you have a specific problem, you want to automate a task with Save Here, that's one way. And then another way of thinking about a problem is something like you have an idea, you're not necessarily trying to improve your own life as a lawyer, but you want to do something that you think is really interesting, like NLP or whatever. Another area, and these are often oriented towards like developing a business plan or maybe just improving your own practice or your own firm. But one other way is to think about like the what would I say, like the social justice issues that you can tackle, right? So a number of years ago, I used to volunteer quite a lot with the Civil Liberties Association, BC Civil Liberties Association, right? And I wrote a little app for them. It's really ugly, so don't go look it up. But a little app for them to have their arrest pocketbook on an Android phone, right? Like I approached them and I said I wanted to work on this. That was before I went to law school, but I wanted to be involved in this. So if you have some other thing that you're passionate about, you're probably going to find developers who are interested in building some kind of software to advance that same cause. So that's another way I would say to connect with people, although it's a little more indirect. Yeah, I guess that's my main suggestion there.
Wow. Any pointers?
I don't have anything to add, but I think that for me, the way to get the best out of the meeting is, many times that people would come to you and say they have some idea. For me, sometimes I'm like, can you just write out a little bit or draw out or something? If they actually do something like that, just a little, then they're serious. If they just have one sentence or not, I don't want to meet with them because they don't have time later on. So if they could spend some time for me at the beginning, I know that I could get something from them and I could work from them.
That's a pretty interesting test. I kind of like it. Another thing to think about, as a lawyer, how easy is it for you to go and talk to another lawyer, potentially in a different field, and assess how good they are at their job?
Yeah, it could be hard.
Sure. And so likewise, imagine that that's now not a lawyer, but a tech professional, and vice versa. So that assessment of who's giving good advice, who's not giving good advice, that can be kind of interesting as well. Another approach, if you're looking at if you're serious about, say, building a product, and you have a budget, and you have maybe a firm that's willing to accommodate it, then perhaps working with an advisor, but then maybe somebody that you can vet, an advisor, and then maybe bring in interns or more of a junior team, but have an advisor be able to spend some time to help to make sure that the product, first of all, is developed. It goes through a product development sort of cycle, and you kind of go out and prove that you have something that other people would, maybe your firm for one could be a stakeholder in it, that they would be interested in using and using as a paid software product, for example. And then as you start to bring that out to other firms, would they be interested in that? And if you could get that much, if you could get 2 or 3 or say 4 firms that would say, yes, I would pay for this product if it were built, then I can probably get you people to build it for you right now.
So you bring up some great points. One of them, though, is about telling if it's a good program. If you're working with a good programmer. And so you're totally right, especially like with the public dealing with lawyers. They have no idea really, other than we have big certificates on the wall and then a suit or whatever. But so for programmers, like, what are some indicators from your point of view that we should be looking for or asking about to determine, is this a good partner to work with us?
University pedigree. I think in that case, I think go with your gut is probably the best that I could give, to be honest, without going through a proper vetting. But
Unless you're an expert, you can't tell. Like you'll be able to tell them more than you, but like you can't, like from your point of view, you can't tell the difference between someone who's crazy and someone who's a master. Like you just can't tell. The same way I can't tell the same for a lawyer. Like I don't know who's crazy and who's a master.
Yeah,
Or both.
a crazy master.
I think that when if you're someone non-tech, I think the problem is like basically, it's parallel. It goes both ways. How do you, if you're a non-lawyer, find a good lawyer, and how do you, if you're a lawyer, find a good developer? One thing, it's also basically a hiring problem. Like even if you're in a software company and you know what a good programmer looks like
If
how
it's an HR person, that's it. Not if it's another like developer. That's it.
Yeah, but even so, even when you are another developer, it's still hard to pick them, right? So like this is hard. One thing I would say that's pretty important, especially if you're getting into a partnership, is does that developer communicate clearly, right? We think a lot about what are the developer's technical skills, and whether they're a genius or whatever else, but is that person going to communicate to you? And I don't mean like they have particularly phenomenal language skills or anything, right? I don't think it matters how many languages you speak or how well you speak them, but if that person is going to communicate with you and tell you like what's going on with the project and is going to be patient and talk to you about how the thing works and what needs to be done to get to what your goal is, because that's your relationship more than the technology over time is can you talk to that person?
That only really matters if that's what you care about.
Yeah. It's also like, so when you create a company, the founders involved, they're gonna have to work with each other for years. Can you get along? Right. Like I have friends that I like that I could never found a company with. I can't get along with them. Like I can get along with them for like short periods, but not for like years on end, right? But that's what you have to go through when you build a company. So are your personalities compatible? Do the things you want, like could they work together, or like are they in conflict?
Right, yeah. So I mean I think that's kind of parallel to what I'm talking about.
Do you have any thoughts on how to pick a good programmer?
Yeah, I think it depends on the solution that we're trying to solve, right? I mean, you want to pick the best programmer is maybe for like a very big project or something very complicated. But if something simple, say some automation, something small, I think it's very important to be able to work with lawyers, and I find it very difficult to talk and to deal with lawyers. So I think maybe not the greatest programmer, but who can work with lawyers, maybe will get the job done. It's the super smart computer guy who doesn't want to talk, and there's a lawyer who always want to talk, might not work.
Can I just? Well, I'm sorry. No, you had your hand up first. Go ahead.
Something here, but do you guys know if there's any lessons that we can take from other professional sectors in terms of how they develop technologies moving forward in terms of innovation? Like if we look into the health services or accounting or what have you, has a lot of innovations come in-house, or has it come through partnerships that are being done externally?
Like innovation is a discovery problem, right? I don't know what it is, right? So you're like randomly searching the dark.
One of the things on top of that is also, you could probably go anywhere, literally anywhere here right now, and poke at 10 or 15 different things that we're doing very inefficiently that we could come up with something to do it better. But do you care? Do you want to actually change that? Do you have, and I think going back to the problem about like the programmer, how good or not they are, how much does that matter? If you're able to if you have a problem that's a defined problem, then you're going to be able to tackle it and come up with a solution. And if you have that, I think any developer at any level is going to be able to build it out. How well it works, how easy it is to change later. You said, as a product grows, it can become much more difficult to change. Depending on who's working on it, that can be much more or much more. But there's and then of course how quickly it gets developed. But going back to your point, most of the time, like one bit of advice that I got when I was first getting into programming about if I wanted to start a business was to go around to businesses and ask them where their pain points are with Excel, for example. And if I can find that, then I can find something I can automate.
Could I kind of reword what I was asking you?
Mm-hmm.
Does it make more sense to bring developers to the problem or to take the problem to the developers, right? Do we bring you into the firm and say, hey, here's how everything's working, here's a bigger picture of it all? Or does it make more sense to kind of bring the problem into your field?
So it depends on both sides, I think. Like on the one hand, if you have a problem that you can define a solution to, and you can vet the product and say, yes, this is a product, go through the product development, and then bring it to a developer, then you don't need a partner as a developer. Potentially, you can just hire somebody to build that for you. If you're looking for somebody to partner with you, then it might be a different story.
You're talking great ideas and talking about local engagement with software developer, doing educational. The various talks about outsourcing to Bulgaria, China, India, because big companies cannot go to campus hire or something here, but to start out, pros and cons. We hear a lot of horrible stories and everything.
So going back to some of the points that everybody's made, just do this. If those are the type of requirements you have, it's just this. It's only that. If it seems simple, it's not. And that won't work probably very well by just outsourcing, and not just to developers potentially. You might need to bring people in that can understand the product development of it. that are going to be able to say, okay, so what exactly does this do? Who exactly are your users? Can we build up some, maybe it's user personas? Can we actually go out? Actually, one of the reasons I mentioned Shannon Salter, and one of the things that impressed me was she actually went out onto the streets and talked to people, people that were from all income levels, all ages, shapes, and sizes that would actually be affected by something like an online resolution dispute portal that everybody needs to use, whether they're, well, I guess if they're illiterate, then they might not be able to, but
You can still use it.
well, there you go. So they maybe click through, and all sorts of things that have to be taken into consideration for some products, maybe not for all. So I would say that if you have a very clearly defined problem and a very clearly defined solution for that problem, such that you can say, this is the exact development work that needs to be done, then it would be relatively easy to outsource. If you cannot say exactly that, then probably not. And so I would say you'd want your technical advisor to be able to help you with that process, and then say, yes, we could outsource this to these teams that I'm comfortable with, versus, no, we really need to have this in-house because it's not well-defined and we don't know what we're doing.
I'm wondering, if I can, whether it's realistically even possible for a developer who is, say, not hasn't spent his entire or her entire life around lawyers, etc., to be able to speak with that lawyer in such a way that they can actually gather in what they have to do. I mean, the lawyer, before they speak with the person who's going to presumably help them put the thing together, would have to draw all the algorithms, would have to draw all of the flow charts in terms of their logic, would have to identify what the end goal of each part of their software project is. If they didn't do that, you'd just sit there having a conversation. You better have lots of booze, because lawyers, when they give you rule of thumbs things, they don't say, well, now, based on the 14 things that came before this in this order, my opinion is this. They give you the opinion and then a little bit of mumbo jumbo. And this is where the whole thing fell apart in the late 80s, wasn't it, with expert systems? You had these people who called themselves knowledge engineers, and they had to be like Sherpas, being able to get people to the top of the mountain to be able to understand enough about the program. And so the people who were actually building the programs, when it wasn't good, were the lawyers. They would study the programs, lots of things, lots of computer programs around even then. But unfortunately, being a lawyer and having done that, I know that there's nothing like having a technician, someone who actually knows what the house is supposed to look like when it's finished, right?
Yeah.
And so what I'm suggesting is that the lawyers are probably going to have to come to you. They're going to have to come to you and say, I've mapped this whole thing out. They've done it before. I mean, for years, we've had tax programs, right, which are used by tax lawyers and by tax accountants. Why? Because the lawyers need them. Why do the lawyers need them? Because they're going to get killed by their competition if they don't, and they're going to make bad mistakes. So tax, no brainer, nobody even thinks about it. Family law, same thing again. People who built those programs have lawyers working together with people in the technology. I'm interested to find out, have you seen even a hint of other areas of law where people actually feel they need to get better as lawyers at what they do? Because they could get a hell of a lot better if they use the tools that we have available to us now, for structuring the frameworks that are used for all of our legal cases in the labor and employment area, all built on frameworks.
Jim, actually, maybe you could be an example of that.
Yeah, so much to unpack there. Yeah, it's the domain expertise of the lawyer. I think that needs to, I would say, be brought to the developer, but that will all sort of follow on. I'm not sure if you know, but the point you made about the conversations on which they are. It's got to be a long conversation. It's sitting down back and forth. And here's my domain expertise. Develop something. That's not exactly what I want. And there's lots of iterations back and forth. So unless both parties can commit the time necessary, it's nothing.
I did it with an insurance guy in the States, let me just put it this way. I wanted to do an expert system, using an expert system shell, to see how it would work for something different in the law. And this fellow was interested in the same program. He's an insurance guy, Erie, Pennsylvania, right? I'd never met him before. I still haven't met him. But we did a system together. And it worked out extremely well. But what he had to do is he had to write down all of the rules of the insurance system. And then, of course, I would go over it and I'd say, well, I don't understand what that is. And there's something missing here because we're, right? And I could get back to him and write an email or something like that. So I don't think it's a conversation for sure, but I think at the very end when you're trying to really nail some stuff down, like what is your end result here? Where do we stop?
Yeah,
Stuff like
and on
that.
Point, I would just follow on that. However expert you think you are in a particular area of law, until you sit down, try to lay it out, and map it out, you weren't there.
That now
So
speaks
that's
the
a
truth.
big process before you even start talking to them.
And it sounds like with a lot of things in the legal world too, as in development, it depends on the complexity of the project and the scope of it as to, how you're going to approach it, how you're going to map it out, how long it's going to take, what kind of communication. Maybe you need someone who's a good translator between those two worlds, if it's a large enough project. So there's a lot of different ways to approach that.
Or someone who's a lawyer and a developer.
Exactly. Hockey ball. So one thing that's been bandied about a little bit in legal tech news has been whether or not put you guys in the hot seat for a little bit, but whether or not developers have any responsibility in terms of the ethics of what they're creating. And this ties into like the flavor of the month with AI and like the fact that it may get to a point where it's making some pretty critical decisions, and how do we control that?
I think you. Oh, sorry.
Oh, so whoever wants to go.
Yeah, no, I think developers absolutely have to be engaging with the ethical issues of what they're building. I think that's like the lesson of history, right? And the classic lesson is the atomic bomb, right? And the scientists who were involved in building that, and some of them said to themselves, "Oh, I just build whatever, I build bombs, I smash atoms, and I don't need to think about those issues." But I think you absolutely need to as a developer, as really a lawyer does as well, right? I mean, lawyers' ethics are a little bit different, so it allows them to act in a lot of cases that other people would be really uncomfortable with. But I think, at the end of the day, as a developer or as a lawyer, you need to decide what is it that you want to put your energy into. Do you want to put it into something, building, nuclear power or nuclear bombs? And I think absolutely you need to engage with those problems.
I think the flip side to that as an example is you alluded to the nuclear power versus nuclear bombs. It's not an if or, that it's the same thing. And so when you look at nuclear power, that's actually one of the cleanest, most efficient energy, maybe the cleanest, most efficient energy resource that we currently have. And that's great. It's wonderful, and it's actually incredibly safe, bar a couple of incidents that we've had. But then you're right. Then there's that atomic bomb. Where does ethics even come into play with something like that? Developing this amazing energy resource, and then knowing that people are going to use it, how they use it. I think that I think there's definitely an aspect if I'm building a software system that I know is going to be used for malicious purposes and is an illegal thing, I probably shouldn't be using it. Now, if I'm doing that for the state, do I have any choice?
So I think you highlighted a good point about it's not like a black and white thing either. And I think lawyers are well acquainted with this, but nuclear bomb, nuclear power, like it's not a black and white thing, and you're going to have to make difficult decisions in some cases. And there are some things that really are malicious, right? There's software actively being used in the United States and possibly in Canada as well for deciding who gets let out on parole, right? And for policing decisions about what neighborhoods they patrol and these kind of things. And these softwares they're implementing algorithms, and they're implementing algorithms that are basically reinforcing racial bias, and that's a pretty bad thing, right? So you need to think about whether you want to participate in that or not.
But a lot of that, it wasn't obvious when the algorithms were designed. that that's what they would be doing, right? So a lot of these issues come up around like training sets for AI and building in sort of diversity into your design process so those things get caught. Because people designing those algorithms probably weren't thinking that they would be reinforcing those kinds of issues. They were thinking, oh look, this tracks pretty well, right? And so that's a better question. It's like, how do we build into those systems that kind of space where these kinds of things are more likely to be flagged before they're an issue?
Actually, I think is at the end of the day is the end user. For example, hacking tool, right? The hacker, you use that. If you use it ethical, you hack your own website. You hack Google hire you to hack them so that you see if there's any whole thing there. So if you use the tool the right way. So it's really hard to say that. I mean, we can develop software that was wrong, but it for a purpose in the US, but not allowed to use in Canada. So if it's used in the US, it's right. The user is wrong. So the end user will have to make that decision, I think. The software is just there. It's just a tool. We create tool utility there.
So to add to that, I would say, what do we think about a device that is recording your behavior all the time that you carry with you? It's also potentially recording other people's behavior and also being monitored by who knows. Is it ethical then to own one of these?
Yeah, well, we're finding out more and more about whether or not it is.
That's a question to lawyers.
Yeah.
Yeah. So whose responsibility is it? I guess it's everyone's in a sense, but as developers, is it that there should be new regulation about actually how you develop?
Who's regulating the regulators?
You have a problem. Who's ethics, right? Like there isn't. Like I mean, you could take the approach like there's an absolute ethics. Then who gets to decide those? And then the other part is like, okay, well, whose ethics are started, right?
Yeah. Well.
So is the question more, when you're working with a developer, is ethics a question you want to have at the beginning of your conversation, right? About what you want to put together and how it's going to be used in the end.
True. But you might not even know, right? I'm sure that, well, I was going to say, I'm sure that whoever developed guns didn't realize what they'd be used for.
Yeah, maybe. All right, so aside from my questions, if there was one subject that you wanted to talk about, because a lot of what I might ask is kind of like the straight ahead, what a lawyer might ask a developer about. But if there's something that you want to talk about that hasn't been brought up, what do you think?
We got a question over there that might actually lead into it.
Without giving out all the roadmap of Clio or something, what are your thoughts on all of you at the progressive web apps, WA, and how are they going to impact practice software management software? Are they going to be enough to, what's the pros and cons enough, going to be enough to work? Because it seems to be it's going to work on all the mobile sets because it's easy to use. What are your thoughts about PWA and the program?
Sorry, what do you mean by PWA?
So
web apps that you might have using like Starbucks.
I can explain a little. So basically, the question is about progressive web apps, which is basically if you have, I think it's only available for Android devices at the moment, but if you have, if you're on an Android device and you access a website for something that also has an app, then it can preload parts of the data from that app directly onto your phone. It's a way to give more of an immersive experience instead of just interacting through your web browser. So that's very much like a technology-specific question.
Yeah. So I don't think I have
the
a
Russians yet.
Sorry. I don't.
Well, if it is,
Yeah, I don't think I have.
Is Google?
Yeah, I don't think I have much to add to that. It's kind of a, it's using something on a mobile device is better if it's not just a web browser, right? It's kind of an implementation detail. It's about the ease of the user experience, pleasant, like how pleasant it is, how easy it is to use. I think that's the main thing. I don't think that it's really gonna, it's a marketing angle, and it's, our application is better because we do X, right? And I think that's true, but I don't think it's gonna change any games necessarily. I think it's technology.
I'd say that back in the, I think probably 60s, was it at the Palo Alto Research Center when the keyboard mouse monitor interface was sort of envisioned, they probably would have said, this maybe has a 10-year lifespan before something else comes out. Yet we're still using that every day. So I was going to say, how long do you think these devices are going to be a primary interface for us in the internet? Maybe not more than 10 years. And so maybe it won't be that important or interesting, but maybe it will. It's with the rate of change and progression. You can speculate that AR is going to be quite interesting. Is AR now going to offer progressive web app experience or VR? Is there going to be some next step to that? Are we going to see that in the next few years? And again, so it really comes down to that, like, are people using this? And I would say that when you look at interesting and emerging new technologies that are changing things, for example, blockchain, ways to interact with it. Sure, you can have a mobile wallet or something like that, but when we look at a lot of things, CryptoKitties would be an example, or a lot of interfaces where you're accessing them through a browser, but you need to log in via some sort of wallet, or at least by identifying you are the one that has access to your private keys. Then currently the technology is not there to do that on a mobile phone, but we can do it on a desktop or such type of interface.
Starbucks is DWA. Or something like
Sure.
Starbucks, AliExpress.
Right.
I think that's one thing that I want to mention is, you mentioned Starbucks, right? How many users
Yeah, mass community
versus
market.
lawyer, and I think we can do anything, we can develop anything. Is there money in to invest in that, and what is the return on the investment? That's at the end of the day.
To build on what Paul's saying here, I can only speak from my experience and experience with my firm, but all of this high level stuff talking about AI in the future, futurology and all that is incredibly interesting, and I'm sure we're all thinking about that in the back of our head and how that's going to change the world and everything. But most of what lawyers and law firms care about is workflow management and file management and that kind of thing. We're pretty, as Paul said, it's a pretty conservative.
You forgot billing.
What's that, sorry? And billing. Oh, you laugh, but it's true. That's all we care about, right?
Yeah.
So while it's interesting to talk about all this stuff, I think as developers, you've got to be prepared that we're going to want really boring things that you're not really going to want to work on. And some of those high-level things, talking about active language, being able to analyze all of that. Some of that stuff is what we like about doing in our job, right? So rather than some more mundane things. So just maybe be prepared that most of the problems that we're going to come to you, that it's going to be extremely.
I just want to make this one point, because it runs through my mind every time I hear this discussion, and that is that the lawyers, I've been a lawyer for 35 years, been in the big firms, the small firms, and now I'm an adjudicator. So I'm in none of the firms. Are going to change their tune when they start getting their asses kicked by other lawyers. And only then. I see no appetite for it right now in Western Canada, the places that I've seen. I saw quite a bit of appetite for it in New York amongst the big firms there, who attended conferences and talked about what they were doing and what partners they were actually seconding off to take care of certain projects. Now, they seemed a bit scared because their clients were saying to them, we're not going to train your juniors anymore. You bill your juniors out to us at $1,000 an hour, which is probably not true. And for doing research, don't you guys know the law? We're not paying for that anymore. Terrified them. So they started looking for these solutions, which are coming up now through, IBM and the one that won the game show thing, and the one we have here in Canada that's a spin-off from that. But I'd say, just like from what I hear in Vancouver, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying people are still very comfortable. They do their 1,500, 1,800 hours a year. Everybody does the same thing. Nobody's got any particularly efficient systems outside of maybe some automated document assembly and some, and you're talking now about some stuff that the commercial solicitors would be interested in terms of blockchain and things like that. But I say, hopefully by the time you're through law school and you are about 5 years in, you'll be one of those people who say, I can see it coming, that these guys down here are gonna kick our butt shortly. And you'll get on to that. But I agree with you right now that there's nothing going on.
I agree that it's definitely somewhat of a blockbuster situation, right? That eventually it's going to require change. But I'd like to, I know we've had participation through this, and that's fantastic. I just want to open it up for anyone who hasn't had a chance to ask a question. And shoot, how about you?
Yes, I do have a question. First of all, I just want to add up to Drew's previous answer about progressive web apps. Now, iOS and iPhone specifically now support progressive web apps. And second of all, I have a question that is quite general, but I believe Khoa, we have met this situation a lot. So that is the question of, so when a lawyer, he wants a specific feature, and he wants a developer to implement it. But it's going to be very hard for the developer to make it because it will involve changing the database schema, changing the whole entire database code just for a small feature. So in that kind of argument, what do you guys normally do about it? Do you go with the lawyer and you change everything, or do you just try to argue about it?
I think that the easiest thing is you assume that there's schema, there's database, there's software. Maybe there isn't. So I mean, there's a lot of manual stuff being done, and that's what exactly because Hamish worked as an assistant and he went to law school, so he sees things in two different angles, and he gave me a lot of feedback. And so, for example, we know that there are a lot of things that Clio could add in. We know that there are a lot of things that we could do. But like for me, when I estimate the amount of time that I have to put in to create something, I'm thinking maybe it's not worth it. I know it will be more efficient. I know that it's something that we need. But will that make money? Will any other law firm will be using it? And that, I don't know, you see a bit small. Maybe the US is a different market?
Yeah, I would say it's kind of, it's partly a negotiation and it's partly a matter of how general it is, as you said, right? Like how many other law firms are going to use it. We have feature requests that are never going to get done because some of them really are phenomenal in what they require in changing the schema, right? And other ones can be pretty significant, but we can implement them because it's a negotiation. Some other features are off the table, and this feature is on because it's particularly important to a large number of customers. It involves, for us internally within the company, a lot of research into what the impact of those features is going to be. So it's like a negotiation between developers and product managers. And I'm looking at Ainsley here because was one of our product managers. I should have called on you earlier with that question about PWA. So it's a negotiation between developers and product managers, like internally in the company, and then there's business decisions that go on as well about like, okay, well, is it worth our while? Because if it's worth our while, we'll change the schema, but that's a high threshold too, right?
I think it brings up a few different things to look at. So one of the things is, do you have to change the schema? How have you developed your application? What does it look like? Can you do this separate without making any changes? And probably you can, but then what are the processes to that? It's always, I think with almost everything, it's always about managing trade-offs. And so, hopefully you work and live in a world where everything's easy to change and it doesn't break other things. Unfortunately, with most processes, any changed process will break a lot of things, right? And software is no different in that respect. But I think, as you said, exactly, it's often not something that I would make a decision on to say yes or no. I'm going to do this right then, but rather take a look at what those what the benefits are to doing it versus not. Think through how you might do it, maybe a couple of different approaches, and give some estimates of what resources that would actually require to do so. And you might think that like, oh, can you write a system that automates drones entering the building, coming over here, picking up that quarter from the floor and putting it into my pocket? Sure, for about $25 million, versus you getting up and picking it up yourself, which is worth more to you, right?
So how long is a normal average time that you guys spend going back and forth for that specific feature? How long do you spend volume to the point where this is agree on one team?
It really depends.
It really depends.
It really depends.
Which customer is asking? What's the size of the customer? What's the revenue coming from the customer? How many requests do we have?
Well, in this case, I would say it's a company internal app.
Well, I would say it's quite similar to how long does it take to implement to change and implement the change of a process, of a company internal process, for example. Let's say how people are getting paid. How long would that take? How long does that process take?
So we try to consider those options.
Well, it depends on a few things, I think. So it depends on the team.
Yes.
It depends on the complexity of the software and the complexity of the change. Sometimes, so one example, I'll say that with the product that we're working on, we have 2 legal agreements that people need to sign into in order to use our product. And we had 1 last week. This week we have 2. So that was a required change for legal reasons. It happened very quickly.
Does anybody else have some questions that they want?
Actually, so I wonder, I'm a software developer. I'm wondering about this workflow management. Is there something in common by firm or by the area or field?
With regards to law.
Yeah, the area.
Do you want to answer that, Ainsley? It varies quite a lot depending on the practice area and the firm. I mean, there's some common.
Reiterate the question.
Oh, sorry. She was asking about workflow management and whether it varies or whether it's just standard across all legal practices. Is that right?
Yes.
Is that kind of your question?
We can abstract.
Yeah, I mean, there are common elements you can abstract, but there's also a lot of variety. So, there's not a straightforward answer to that question. The reason I'm picking up this question is because it's right in exactly what Clio does, right? But
I'm just wondering, are they using Clio? If does Clio fit the needs?
Yeah, we do have a Clio, and of course there's features just like you were saying that we wish that we had, but Clio as a company has to decide are the features that we wish that we had, are they worth changing your product for, right? And I think that's just kind of a back and forth conversation that happens. And like Khoa said, it's going to be a cost benefit. How big is your customer? How big is the change?
I think Ainsley's got a good answer to this question.
I mean, to answer your question, one of the really interesting things about working in legal tech is that within law, there's so many different workflows. Every practice area has slightly different workflows, slightly different requirements, and the challenge of being legal practice management is it's never going to be one size fits all. So we have to, we're talking about making trade-offs, making decisions. Product managers at Clio are constantly trying to figure out if building this thing is valuable enough for us to spend time on, given who it's going to serve, because it's never going to serve everybody. Everyone has such specific requirements. So we have an open API that anyone can build on. So we have hundreds of integrations that can start to offer that specialization for specific practice areas. For anyone here who's thinking about Clio almost fits my Clio, but Clio or whatever almost fits my needs if only it did X, might be an opportunity just to build an integration on Clio to do that really specific thing, which is much easier lift than trying to build practice management from ground up.
Sorry, I'm unfamiliar with Clio and Clio's API, but if I built a service that leverages Clio's API, could I also charge for my service?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a
Lexicata
perfect
intake
example.
form. If you do the intake in Lexicata, then your clicking button goes to Clio. Because Clio doesn't have intake forms at this moment.
There's a nice little ecosystem of different third-party apps that work off.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
But I know Zoom in America, they only focus on immigration law. They're niche specific. They don't do family law, they do anything. They just focus on specific one, that's what they do. Whereas Clear is a platform. And you can integrate all the others. Absolutely.
I think that's actually a good answer to your question as well. Like there are applications out there that are only for immigration lawyers or only for certain practice areas, and that just shows like they believe there's a market for that because that's specialized enough that they pull the general parts into it, but then they really focus on that area.
Do you charge for API access?
Or may know.
I mean, I suppose you could ask the same thing about software. Is there a common tool or set of tools? And I think there are commonalities, but there's also somewhat different tooling. I mean, you could even say something like version control. So everybody uses Git, right? Yeah, except for the people who don't, and the companies that don't.
I use Bucket.
Oh yeah.
Anybody else have?
Not a question, but just if there are developers here who are kind of trying to get a feel for the tech area, kind of trying to see if there's opportunities there. We talked a lot about software tonight that was targeted towards augmenting what lawyers did or sell to law firms. Just keep in mind there's another area that's meant to sort of circumvent that altogether and sort of be direct to consumer as well. There's regulatory issues involved in that, but there's certainly some companies that have had great success. I think there's a huge opportunity in that area too. So.
That's actually a really good point because I think when you were talking about progressive web apps and about Starbucks using it, for example, the first thing that I thought was, well, that's a consumer app. And so, and I think you said as well, you got millions of users around the world using this app. Of course, you're going to have it be user-friendly, whereas if you have something specific to law or specific to lawyers, now you're starting to narrow down your actual user base. Does it really matter? Or are you providing something that they need to use? As an example, online banking, now it's getting better because banks are somewhat competing, but it didn't ever really have to be good. It had to be secure. It had to not lose your money, but it didn't have to be a good, comfortable experience. And so for a long time it wasn't.
All right, so every time we have one of these meetings, I'm really impressed by the questions we get, but tonight, the amount of engagement was really, really great. So I really appreciate that, and I hope you guys come to our next meeting, the meeting after that, and get to know each other better. I'd like to thank our panel, Khoa, Paul, and Drew. Thank you so much for coming tonight.
Something else that I would like to add is that it is very difficult to vet other people, particularly outside of your field. But if you are interested in talking to somebody who I would recommend as being a very senior technical advisor, has experience being CTO in finance industry, in all sorts of other industries, and is very technical, also great at product development and engagement, have a talk to the guy in the black hat.
Black hat. Never look straight ahead. That's my rule.
And not in a metaphorical sense, black hat. Right?
Exactly. Absolutely not.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming. Next month, we're going to have a coffee social. The month after that, a beer social. And we're going to put together another type of event like this or a workshop. So just watch for it and meet up. Thank you very much for coming. Oh, one last thing.